Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to kick off in a few minutes. We're just waiting for some more folks to join, and then we'll kick it off. So thanks for joining, and we'll be with you in a minute. Hi, everyone, we're going to get started in another minute. We're just waiting for some more attendees to join, and then we'll kick it off. So we'll be back with you in a minute. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone, to the SEBANE webinar discussing the future of solar net metering. My name is Mark Sylvia. I'm the Chief of Staff at Blue Wave Solar and have the honor of also serving as the President of the Solar Energy Business Association of New England, aka SEBANE. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation, coming after a very positive announcement last week from FERC, rejecting taking up a case that examines solar net metering. As many of you know, a shadowy association claiming to represent ratepayers filed a petition with FERC at the start of a global pandemic to restrict solar net metering across the country. Now, with that in the rear view, we'll be discussing upcoming challenges and opportunities to leverage solar as a jobs and economic development opportunity in Massachusetts and beyond. Next slide, please. But before we jump in, I just want to share with those of you who have joined who we are, which is likely a friendly reminder for many of you, but given the opportunity, it's nice to talk about who SEBANE is and how we've grown quite a lot since our founding in 2001, and in particular over the last 3 to 4 years. We've continued our mission to protect and promote the New England solar industry through informed policy intervention, coalition building, and stakeholder education. And our membership has steadily grown to more than 80 member companies, including residential and commercial solar developers, installers, consultants, EPCs, manufacturers, distributors, and other service providers, including legal and financial professionals. In addition to our members, I'd also like to give a special thank you to our annual sponsors, Iron Ridge and LG, for their continued partnership and financial support during these times of virtual event programming. I also, we shared this at the solstice, and I know that I speak for our entire board. We're very excited about the activity on our policy committee. We're looking to expand our policy and programming committees. You can see our policy committee is rather large, and we've got a growing programming committee. These are two committees that are instrumental to our work and our mission that I talked about on the last slide. And we'd love to see more members participate who are interested, either on the policy front, chaired by Nick Darbeloff from Sunbug, or our programming committee, which is chaired by Kathy Doyle from Fireflower Alternative Energy. So if you're a SEBANE member and you're interested in joining either of these committees, please reach out to Trish Fields and she'll get you looped in. And so right before we begin, I think it's good, a little bit of housekeeping. We will be taking questions from the audience, from our participants today. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box in your Zoom dashboard. We'll get through as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. So we wanted to just show you exactly where that Q&A icon is and how to submit a question. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to our guest speaker. I'd like to introduce him, Nathan Phelps, who is Regulatory Director at Vote Solar. I always like to say when I get the opportunity to introduce him, he needs no introduction, but it's quite a privilege and honor for him to be with us today. Nathan focuses on regulatory design for distributed generation in the Eastern US in his capacity at Vote Solar. Prior to joining Vote Solar, Nathan was a senior economist at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. And in that capacity, he worked on renewable energy and distributed energy regulation. And I have to say, I had the pleasure of working with Nathan when we were both in state service, and at a time of enormous growth on the distributed generation side and clean energy and climate, Nathan did an amazing job of helping on the regulatory side to implement many of those programs for the industry and for the citizens of Massachusetts. So thank you for that, Nathan. He went to Willamette University for undergraduate studies in both environmental science and politics before attending Tufts University, where he pursued graduate studies in environmental policy. So with that, I'd like to welcome Nathan and turn it over to him.
Thanks, Mark. And thank you everyone for joining the call today, or the webinar today. And I'm going to kind of run through the petition, the NERA petition to FERC, and basically how it unfolded, and obviously ultimately the decision. So Vote Solar, just real quickly, we're a national nonprofit. We focus on the state level. And with that, let's dive in. This issue really comes down to fundamentally the jurisdictional issues between the federal government and the states. So I throw this up here not to explain how the electric system works, but to kind of help paint the picture of where the divide currently stands, more or less right now. So we really have, the states are focused on the retail, and the federal government is focused on the wholesale. So that's the state public utility commissions are focused on the retail, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is focused on the wholesale. Now, this is not exactly how it works. Some states still are vertically integrated, meaning their utilities still own generation. So the state jurisdiction, the retail goes all the way up to generation. In other situations, the federal government is still regulating, for instance, some small hydroelectric dams, which are actually on the retail are actually on the distribution system. So the federal jurisdiction actually goes down onto the distribution system. But more or less, the divide here of where state jurisdiction stops and federal jurisdiction starts, or vice versa, depending on how you're looking at it, is really the fundamental question for the NERA petition to FERC. So back in April, that's where my life got upended. It wasn't actually with COVID that my life really got upended. It was when NERA filed this petition. That's when I was working many, many hours fighting the petition. And when it happened, actually, when NERA filed the petition, the commission, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, set a very, very tight turnaround, which scared me even more. And then the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, basically the associations of PUCs, or in Massachusetts, the Department of Public Utilities, they asked for an extension. It was only granted in part. And so we had this comment deadline in June 15th, which was still a pretty tight turnaround. And then just last week, we actually had a FERC decision. So fundamentally, when NERA requested a FERC is that anytime a person with solar, or a net metering customer to be exact, exported electricity to the grid, that be considered a wholesale sale of electricity. So they were trying to say that states should be prohibited from allowing customers to run their meter backwards. That's essentially what they were trying to request that FERC do. Request that FERC assert jurisdiction over any time a customer exports electricity to the grid. Now, that is really fundamental to net metering, the ability to run that meter backwards and therefore net your consumption and your generation over the course of a billing period. In addition to that, there's also how is a customer compensated for any electricity that is exported to the grid, or conversely, if netting over the course of a month was still allowed, how can that customer be compensated for that net export, if there is a net export? And NERA requested that anytime there's an export to the grid, that has to be compensated at the wholesale rate of electricity. In New England, that's pretty easy to think about because we have the ISO New England, and they have the wholesale energy market, which, depending on the time of the day, can be a few cents or more, but if you average it out, it's really just a few cents. Now, I want to note that net metering is not a new issue. Actually, Massachusetts was the first state to implement net metering in the country. That was way back, almost 40 years ago. And then FERC has actually looked at net metering multiple times already. So the first time was about 20 years ago. This was Mid-American's, a utility in Iowa, and they essentially requested what NERA is requesting again. And at that time, FERC said, no, this is not a federal issue. This is a state issue. Net metering is a retail policy and therefore is subject to state jurisdiction. The Sun Edison case was similar, but it involved, in particular, third-party owners and whether or not that was still allowed in the net metering framework. In both of these times, FERC said this is a state issue. Now, the implications, if the NERA petition were adopted by FERC, were just absolutely enormous and devastating. We're talking enormous financial impacts to customers, potentially having to pay taxes on the energy that they are exporting to the grid, the state implications, how states would have to roll this out, and then the jurisdictional divide that I was talking about at the beginning would have been really disrupted by this. I should note that right now there are about 2.2 million households that net meter in the country. There's about another 100,000 businesses that net meter in the country. And if the NERA petition had been adopted, there really wouldn't have been an opportunity for any legacy treatment of these existing facilities. That's because essentially FERC wouldn't have been able to give legacy treatment for something that they were viewing as illegal to begin with. And there are net metering customers in 49 states. The one state that doesn't have any net metering customers, Alabama. So the NERA petition, the implications of it were, or would have been, just absolutely devastating. So before I go into the response, I just want to note that although I spent a lot of time working on this, I was not alone. There were many organizations, many people fighting this petition around the country. Vote Solar, when we first learned of the petition, we decided that there were really three things we needed to do. The first was that we needed to make sure that the states were aware of what was going on, because the implications of this were that the federal government was going to be taking away some authority from the states. The second was we wanted to make sure that individuals had an opportunity to voice their opposition, so we created a website, savesolar.org. And then the last was we provided or wanted to provide an opportunity for organizations to voice their opposition. So we created a sign-on letter. We drafted that, or I drafted that with the Center for Biological Diversity. And we wanted to make sure that that letter had a very strong focus on energy equity, energy justice, because one of the arguments that NERA made in their petition was that low-income customers were really hurt by net metering. On the state level, we had a great response. So 31 states plus DC intervened in the docket. 37 states and DC commented in the docket. And all of the comments coming from the states were in opposition to the petition. It was just overwhelming opposition from the states to the petition. It was really great news. I should note that this was bipartisan. It impacted red states, blue states, purple states, didn't matter. We wanted to make sure that everyone understood that this was not a political issue. This was a state versus federal issue, and it was, as a result, completely bipartisan. As far as the total comments that came in, if you count up individual actions, it was just overwhelming opposition to the petition. So you can see over 57,000 comments in opposition and 22 in support. And the big thing I want to reiterate again is every single state that came out and weighed in on this was in opposition. So about 1 month after the comments came in, FERC dismissed the petition on procedural grounds. This is very important. They did not dismiss it on the merits of the petition. The procedural grounds on which the petition was dismissed is basically the commission decided they didn't want to make a statement, more or less. They had the option to do that. And they said NERA didn't really identify any individual state policy. They just made the argument based on the generic idea of net metering. The decision was unanimous, and that was shocking in all honesty, but also very, very encouraging. However, it's not all good news. There were a couple concurring decisions specifically MACNAME said, we're not addressing in any way, shape, or form the issues underlying the petition. And it's really best to address the issues in a specific situation where basically the facts of a state policy are in question. And then the Danley concurrence said basically the commission is going to have to address this eventually. And he is worried about the potential patchwork of decisions that could result if this goes through the federal courts. Now, taking these two together, I would note it's very concerning to me about the possibility how this could unfold in the future at FERC. I would say that these two concurring decisions are basically inviting somebody, whether it's NERA or somebody else, to come forward and challenge a specific state policy again. Now, it's unlikely that something could move very, very quickly before the elections. So it's possible that the current FERC composition would not be ruling on net metering again, but that doesn't mean that FERC overall will not be ruling on net metering again at some point in the future. So with that, I want to stop, make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A, and I'll turn it back over.
All right. Thank you very much, Nathan. Trish, are you going to coordinate questions?
Sure. So it looks like we have a couple that have come in the Q&A box. And just as a reminder to folks, if you do have any questions for Nathan or Mark, please feel free to use the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. So Nathan, Rossini is wondering if you can comment on the recent PURPA decision at FERC and what that might mean for both QF and net metering rates in Mass.
Good question. Two different implications there. So I'll start PURPA with the PURPA decision in general. Last year, FERC opened a proceeding to basically change their PURPA regulations. That became a priority for the chair of FERC, Chatterjee, who said basically PURPA has gone too long without essentially any revisions. So they put out a proposal for changing the regulations last year. That proposal was quite bad, actually. So the decision that came out last week, the proposed final regulations, is an improvement upon the proposal from last year on changing the regulations, but that's a very low bar. So there's still very concerning direction or very concerning movement on PURPA. Specifically, FERC is proposing reducing the rebuttable presumption as to the size of QFs that are eligible. Basically, that's a fancy way of saying currently there's a 20 megawatt threshold. If you're below 20 megawatts in essentially a functioning wholesale market like New England, if you're below 20 megawatts, then you can be a QF. If you're above 20 megawatts, then there's a presumption that you should be going and participating directly in the wholesale market. FERC is proposing lowering that from 20 megawatts down to 5 megawatts. There's also some direction that FERC is trying to provide to the states on how to set avoided cost rates. That's always been an issue with PURPA. It's completely in the discretion of the states on how to structure the avoided cost compensation. And FERC is just trying to give some better indications on that, in my opinion, a very negative way. And then finally, there's also the potential that states or utilities specifically could start to say, we have enough installed capacity, we do not need any more. And that would mean that one of the fundamental premises of PURPA, which is anybody can come along and install renewable generation and start to be compensated as a QF, that could potentially be capped in states. So that's a very concerning direction. Now, as far as the implications for Massachusetts go, well, essentially the Department of Public Utilities has had an open docket for a long time on how to set the avoided cost rate, and that has sat dormant now for over 3 years. So there's been a very big question mark looming over of qualifying facilities in Massachusetts to begin with, and I think that this only makes it worse.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks for that response to Russ. Brad is asking, is there any truth about low-income customers being hurt by net metering?
Well, that really depends on your perspective. So I'm going to lay out the argument that Nero was trying to make. I want to note at the very beginning that I do not agree with this. But the argument that Nero was trying to make is that essentially only rich people install solar, and therefore only rich people net meter. But everyone has to pay for the cost of net metering. So therefore, low-income customers are subsidizing the wealthier customers. A couple things about that. First off, we're actually getting to the point now where solar is becoming much more affordable to everyone, including low-income customers. So what Nero is trying to do is essentially cut the legs out of net metering just when we're approaching low-income customers being able to participate. The second is that argument takes a very narrow view of cost associated with the energy system and is ignoring essentially the pollution as an example. And there's very little doubt that low-income customers, environmental justice customers, have been bearing the brunt of pollution since the start of the energy system. It's the fundamental premise of environmental justice is that some communities essentially are paying a far higher price with their health than other communities. And renewable energy, distributed generation, is a way to actually cut down on that pollution, cut down on the inequitable sharing of the cost of pollution.
Okay, next question from Theodora at NextAmp. Can you clarify how net metering impacts LMI customers?
Well, I just talked about it a little bit. The general argument, once again, is that all customers have to pay for the cost of net metering, including low-income customers. So that is how net metering impacts them financially. As far as the participation goes, I don't think there's any doubt that historically we've had lower adoption rates by low-income communities for solar than medium and higher income customers. I'll just say that is definitely starting to change. There's some proposals in Massachusetts. I've been working on a couple of them in order to increase adoption by LMI customers. I will save that for another time. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn a little bit more about that. And in general, I would just note that when it comes to technology in general, this is exactly what we would expect to see. The early adopters for any type of technology tend to be the wealthier customers. And then as penetration increases, as costs start to decline, we start to see a more equitable adoption by all customers.
Okay, we've got another question from Russ Aney. Can long-term contracts like 83C get around QF issues that may arise due to FERC decisions?
That is a very easy question to answer, and yes. 83C type of contracts or long-term contracts in general are not any type of violation of PURPA at all. Therefore, there is no issues with FERC asserting jurisdiction with those long-term contracts.
Okay, we're going to shift a bit to NERA. We have a few folks asking about kind of finding more out about NERA, who's funding them, what do we know about them, so on and so forth.
This is actually one of the most troubling aspects of NERA, in my opinion. They do not disclose their funders. So we do not know who is funding them. We have a little bit of insight, but it's very, very little. So we know that they've had, or at least this past year, they had 22 members. So I would not consider an organization with 22 members to be a ratepayer organization, in my opinion. That's something that we would see more with a trade organization or some type of business association. That being said, in NERA's last filing for their petition, they included a statement from one of their members. That statement came from somebody who was, he's not retired, but who was a consultant that worked primarily with the oil and gas industry. So it's a little hard to extrapolate exactly what that means, but we can infer that it's likely that their members do include people or organizations that have some type of affiliation with the oil and gas industry. We don't know exactly who they are. We don't know exactly how much they pay, but the operating budget for NERA last year was a little over $200,000. NERA only has one full-time employee, that's Mark Brown, and the filing fee for them to make this petition to FERC was over $30,000. So they likely got an influx of funding from somebody or some organizations or something like that in order to make this petition. But beyond that, there's very little that we actually know about NERA. One interesting thing that happened is about a month and a half or so into this docket, Eversource Energy actually came out publicly and said, we are not a member of NERA. We are not behind this petition. Because up until that point, there had been some speculation that maybe Eversource was behind this petition. And Eversource publicly came out to essentially denounce NERA. So that's about the extent of what we know about NERA.
Okay, I'm going to shift to politics. This is an election year. How might a change in the federal administration impact future FERC decisions in your point of view, Nathan?
It's always difficult to try to read the tea leaves on that, but my expectation would be that if we have a change in the administration, the makeup of the FERC Commission would likely change, possibly change dramatically towards the benefit of renewable energy. And I'll note, towards the benefit of state policy making. What we've seen over the past, especially over the past, say, 9 months, is a hostility of FERC towards renewable energy state policy. So I don't want to go down too far a rabbit hole here, but just as an example, FERC ruled in the PJM wholesale market territory. So that's the Mid-Atlantic going up to the Midwest. FERC ruled that essentially when it comes to the capacity market, PJM needs to exclude any resources that have state support. They said that essentially any type of state policies that give money to renewable energy facilities means that they should be ineligible for the capacity market, and therefore they should be excluded because they're distorting the market. When somebody pointed out that the federal government actually supports fossil resources, the more traditional resources, and therefore distort the market, FERC said, yeah, but that's the federal government, so we're not going to take that into account. We're only going to take into account resources that have state support, and we're only going to exclude those resources. So we're seeing, especially over the past 9 months, increasing hostility by FERC towards state policy. And that means that essentially FERC is showing preference for the traditional generation, more or less the fossil generation assets around the country, especially in the wholesale markets.
This is somewhat related from a media relations point of view. We have an attendee asking what could we potentially do as an industry, as well as the potential mainstream media do to bring this more into the public consciousness. And then relatedly, I have someone who sent me a chat asking how companies could stay more involved to make sure that FERC can't do harm.
Excellent questions, not very easy to answer. When it comes to media, one of the problems that we've seen right now is essentially a lack of resources and a lack of bandwidth, and essentially other issues going on, specifically the pandemic and the economic downturn. I wouldn't be surprised if NERA kind of seized the opportunity of the pandemic and economic downturn to submit the petition, basically under the cover of the pandemic and the economic downturn. That being said, I don't actually have any inside knowledge into NERA's motivations or anything. All of that, though, is to just say that when it comes to media coverage of what happened at FERC, it's been extremely difficult to get any type of coverage. And I have a hard time saying the media has a fault because of this, because what we've seen locally, regionally, and nationally is that news outlets have had to cut a lot of reporters, cut their hours, furlough reporters, etc. So there's just fewer reporters actually out there to cover the news. And this is the type of story that is not getting traction as a result.
And how about SEBANE members in the industry? Is there anything that SEBANE could be helping with, Nathan, to support, Vote Solar and the rest of the folks around, ensuring that FERC can't do any further harm that's outside of any kind of media tactics that we might deploy?
Sure. FERC is an interesting place to work, in all honesty. It's not exactly easy to get involved at FERC. That being said, there's a couple resources, one in particular that I think would be helpful for people to track what's going on at FERC if they're interested. There's something called the Sustainable FERC Project. It's part of the NRDC, and they have a lot of focus on what's happening at FERC. So if you want to go and actually sign up for Sustainable FERC newsletters, as an example, or follow them on social media like Twitter or whatever, that would be a good way to actually kind of keep up to date as to what's happening at FERC. As far as participation goes, I'm happy to, like, when something comes up, reach out to SEBANE like I've done in the past, just to give a heads up as to what's going on at FERC. SEBANE signed on to some of the work that I was leading for Vote Solar in opposition of the NERA petition, just as an example. And then beyond that, I think just trying to stay in touch as to what's going on nationally. I'll note, by the way, I said this at the beginning, Vote Solar focuses primarily on the state level. When it comes to federal stuff, there's very little that we do. We do virtually no work at Congress, and almost all of our work at the federal level is actually at FERC. And that's not very much, to be clear. We do a few things, especially where it intersects with state policy, like net metering, as an example.
Great. So before we shift to some more specifics regarding Massachusetts, I just want to give attendees one more chance to pose any questions for Nathan in the Q&A box. Give it one more minute for folks to do so.
And while we're waiting, Trish, it's a good opportunity for me to also highlight, in addition to our working directly with Vote Solar on the NERA petition, just mention that SEBANE itself filed comments opposed to the NERA petition before FERC. We also engaged with our membership to get feedback from them to ensure that we were able to make our members' voices heard. I'll also comment, I thought Vote Solar did a phenomenal job in providing different avenues for people to participate in that process. Even as individuals, it was very easy for me, and I think hundreds, if not more, people that could go on to that site that Vote Solar provided and populate a letter, standard letter that went out in opposition. So on our own, SEBANE did some work, and it was with help certainly and guidance from Vote Solar, but we did, we identified this as an important priority for our members and engaged our members, and we're also very grateful to Vote Solar for their work on this.
This is Nick Darvaloff. Nathan, I have a question for you. I'm curious as to whether you can talk a little bit about FERC members. I know they're elected to set terms, and would love to hear you just sort of offer some background on how long their terms are, how they get elected, and how the FERC makeup could change following an election.
So they're appointed by the president. They're not elected. And Trump so far has seen or has shown very little interest. At least that's how it appears in FERC in general. So there was actually a while there where FERC couldn't actually do any business because they didn't have enough commissioners in order to have a quorum in order to make a decision. Currently it's a 5-member commission. So you need at least 3 members in order to have a quorum. And there was a time there where FERC only had 2 commissioners appointed. As far as their terms, I actually don't know that specifically. I think it's 5 years, but I could be wrong on that. So don't hold me to that. But the current commission right now is not 5 members, actually. It is 4 members, and although now I want to check that to be sure, but the current framework or the current makeup of the commission basically has 1 Democrat, and then the rest are Republicans. So
I guess to be specific, my question was, I think commissioners serve for 5 years, but am I correct in understanding that it's commonplace for the chair to submit their resignation after a new election, and that's how some change could take place, or am I mistaken?
Yeah, that's not in the rules, but it's quite common to have a lot of turnover on the commission when a new administration comes in. So I would expect that when we have a new administration, whether that is in a few months or 4 years, that when we have a new administration come in, there will be a lot of turnover on the commission. And I'll note that the current chair, Chatterjee, he's more of a political person, meaning he has larger political aspirations than just being chair of FERC. So that it depends on who is appointed. I mean, obviously that's at the discretion of the president, but the current makeup of FERC is not all ideologues, is what I'm trying to say, basically.
Thank you.
So Mark, I believe we've gotten through all of our questions from attendees that were submitted in the Q&A box. So I think we can transition to the mass specific discussion.
Sure, and thank you again, Nathan, for your presentation and for your making yourself available to answer questions. I think these types of forums are super helpful to our membership, and we just appreciate all that you and your colleagues at Vote Solar do for the industry and all the information sharing and the advocacy. I'll just, as another plug, Vote Solar has been instrumental whenever there have been critical state regulatory PUC or DPU regulatory proceedings. They've always been engaged and involved many times, acting as expert witnesses. So whether it was the original SMART program or other critically important regulatory matters that matter to us, Vote Solar has been there as a partner with the industry. So Nathan, to you and your team, thank you very much. And we look forward to continuing this good partnership further.
Thanks, Mark.
Also, sticking with the theme of net metering, I want to now turn it over to Nick Darbeloff, who is our Vice President for Policy. He also works for Sunbug Solar. He's going to talk a little bit about a bill that is pending in the legislature in Massachusetts that is gaining momentum. It's House Bill 2866. And I'll turn it over to Nick for the remainder of the program.
So I think many of us may be familiar with 2866. As you see here on screen, it is a pretty simple insertion of language into the law that governs the current net metering caps. It is 93 words in length in total. I think one important point to make is that it is not a lifting of the caps. Rather, it is an exemption from the caps for net metering facilities. It was reported favorably out of the TUE committee and referred to the Committee on House Ways and Means in March. There was a fair amount of hope and optimism that something would happen thereafter. It hasn't, as is so common. Things wait until end of July for action. And of course, a global pandemic got in the way. But the bill has quite a bit of support. It was introduced by Representative and Speaker Pro Tem Pat Haddad of Bristol County. It is sponsored by Representative and TUE House Chair Tom Golden, Representative and TUE House Vice Chair Carolyn Dykema, Senator Mark Pacheco, who is the chair of the Senate Committee on Global Warming and Climate Change, and over half a dozen other legislators. It is worth noting that the bill is also supported by AIM, the Associated Industries of Massachusetts. This is a pretty big deal because in the past, AIM has rarely, if ever, supported energy legislation, often believing that it poses a burden on ratepayers. Bob Rio, the Senior Vice President of AIM, has been hugely helpful in advancing the bill. And his efforts and AIM's support overall are perhaps an indicator that renewables are of increasing importance to mainline Massachusetts businesses. If that's the case, that's a welcome change in the status quo. We could certainly use AIM's support on renewable legislation. They've got quite a bit of pull on Beacon Hill. So where does H2866 go from here? I don't think there's a lot of hope that the bill is going to be passed independently this session. However, there is some optimism around the possibility that it will be added to pending COVID relief legislation, largely as a job retention and job creation measure. This is logical, since, as many of us believe, the restoration of net metering in National Grid and Eversource West territories would spark a significant uptick in solar installations. So the idea that it could create jobs, or certainly help the solar industry maintain current jobs, makes good sense, and I think that the case will be made and accepted by many legislators. The question is whether it will be accepted by enough. One challenge here, or one issue, is that, again, as you see on screen, 2866 covers Class 2 and Class 3 net metering facilities only. It does not include Class 1, meaning that net metering facilities between 25 kW and 60 kW are left out. This is quite unfortunate. It's an artifact of how the bill came into being and how Class 1 systems were or weren't considered as it was reviewed and reported out of committee. We think there's a chance that Class 1 could get added into the legislation when it is considered for inclusion. It's certainly by no means a given. This would be, if 2866 does manage to find a home embedded within COVID relief legislation, it would be a tremendous boost to the Massachusetts solar industry. Good folks are pushing this hard, and we will be pushing it hard as well, SEBANE and SEBANE's members. I don't pretend to understand the machinations of Beacon Hill intimately, but my understanding is that the way this may play out is that we may or may not see all the legislation pending pass before the July 31 deadline. There's a good chance that Speaker DeLeo will either hold a special session in order to extend the session, or, will either extend the session or launch a special session later in August or even early September. That would allow legislators on Beacon Hill to gain a better understanding of what's happening on the federal level with the CARES 2 Act, so that they can fashion COVID relief legislation against the backdrop of the federal legislation. I think I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions. Mark, I don't know whether you would have anything to add to the comments I offered, since I know you're up to speed on this bill as well.
No, there is a question from Mark Dernberger. Can you provide guidance on the best way to push with our legislators? What should I be asking my rep for? And in this case, he said Kate Hogan. So
that's a great question, Mark. And I think that the short, obvious answer is to ask them to give it the greatest possible consideration. That said, we plan to send a package out to members that will contain some background on 2866, as well as some bullet points that can be used by you, Mark, or other members as they call their representatives. So stay tuned. We will get you some content with which to contact or reach out to your legislator.
And I would just add, I mean, definitely when legislators hear from their specific constituents, the people who live in their district, they're more likely to be supportive of a bill. And of course, the more people they hear from, the better. And I wouldn't just limit it to, I mean, the target at this point is certainly the House of Representatives because that's where the bill is. But you may also want to reach out to your corresponding senator just to make sure that they're aware of it because at some point it will end up in the Senate. So you should certainly reach out to your representative. That's the best direct way. If you have the opportunity, you should also reach out to by letter or email or phone call to the chair of the committee, which in this case, as Nick indicated, is Chair Golden. So those are the steps I would take. I would get more, if you can, convince others to reach out to their reps, but also target your senator and the chair of the committee that legislation is originated from. And I'm sure Speaker Pro Tempore Haddad would appreciate outreach as well. So it's really targeting multiple members of the legislature.
And again, we will send out talking points probably within the next couple of weeks.
Mark and Nick, we also have Russ suggesting the consideration of creating materials that SEBANE members, customers, or prospects might be able to use. Customers that might want to build larger systems to meet more of their needs, but are currently constrained. So perhaps that's something that we could add to our upcoming policy committee call for further discussion.
I think that's an excellent suggestion, Russ. I think that to the extent that businesses can get into the fray and express their support as well, and it is probably as strong or stronger input than that coming from the solar industry. Obviously, we're the job creators, but at the same time, if businesses across the Commonwealth are indicating a desire to see this pass or to see it included, that's a big deal and very, very important. So that will be part of our outreach.
We have another one that just came in from Mark Durenberger as well. Given that the House goes on vacation at the end of July, are we shooting for that deadline?
We are. We're being guided by a couple of folks who've been intimately involved in H2866. As some of you know, it includes Robin Dutta and David O'Connor. So we will work and strategize with them to understand optimal timing. But Mark, you raise a good point. We absolutely want to get it out at the right time or well in time to have the comments reach the intended legislators with plenty of time to consider.
Great. I think that's all that we have for questions on the 2866 topic. Thanks, Nick. So Mark, I'll turn it back to you to close.
Sure, great. Thank you, Trish. Thank you very much, Nick, for highlighting that bill and for all of the members and other participants who joined us today. We see this as a very valuable and important service to provide to our members. So if you do have any other ideas for future webinars on different topics or issues, or other people you would like to hear from, please let us know. Let Trish know, let myself or any other board members know, and Kathy, who's our programming chair, because we want to make these as useful and relevant and as effective as possible. And as always, I don't want to leave without thanking the team at Fields Associates for pulling this together. Trish, Ray, Mary Elizabeth. This doesn't get done without their help and support. So thank you to Fields Associates for another job well done. And it being Wednesday at 12:59, we'll give you a minute back of your day. Have a great rest of the week. And thank you for your support.
Bye-bye.